as an urban planner, that's definitely something I'm always thinking about, is like, where do we build? How do we build? What are we encouraging and incentivizing in order to have this resiliency and this kind of flexibility and the ability for a society to adjust to a changing climate is a really essential point to just kind of think about it and really, you know, not just be this side issue. It should really be inherent in everything that we're thinking about. You know, people who are designing buildings today will be saying, oh, we're designing a 100-year building and we want to make sure that, you know, it works for that whole time. But they're often talking about, you know, making sure that they use the right materials and that the emissions are lessened, and that the kind of like 100 years they're getting out of that building are worth that sort of initial climate impact, and, you know, inherent in all the materials they're using. But they also need to think about what's going to happen with the climate changing over those 100 years. Are the materials you spec, is the design of the building resilient enough to handle anything that might be changing? I mean, here in Seattle, we are kind of like one of the areas that is hit least hard by it, but it's still something that even here we have to consider. And in many other places, it's even more, it's hitting them daily, even today, not just in the future.
Right. You know, I think, you know, in Seattle, I mean, the climate impacts, there may be different, but maybe not less than, right? I guess there's, of course, not hurricanes, but there haven't been, and there won't be. But there are,
Hopefully
you know,
not,
sea level is rising, right? There's already been 9 inches of sea level rise since 1900 at the Seattle tide gauge. We project sea level rise to worsen across most of the state, and by mid-century everywhere in the state. Washington is really interesting from a sea level rise perspective because there are parts of the state that are actually outpacing sea level rise at the moment because of the tectonic setting. But never mind, it's mostly Neah Bay. But I think when we talk about resiliency, I mean, right in Seattle, especially if you're thinking about like an urban environment, the sort of concrete jungle, if you will, if you're entertained by non-technical terms, you know, stormwater management is going to be a huge issue because we're getting more extreme precipitation. We're seeing our winter snowpack, and, you know, winter time precipitation not only increase, but change in characteristics. So it's not necessarily going to be snow, it's going to be rain. You sort of see these Pacific Northwest wide basin characteristic changes that are occurring already and are only going to get worse. And so, you know, this idea of how we prepare our built environment and our environment more broadly for these changes that we know we've committed to and are well documented, I think is a really critical one. And then, of course, there are, you know, what we've completely missed so far in the discussion. And again, Elizabeth, I think you bring some wonderful expertise and think about this more deeply in the context of this industry and associated policies, but is equity, right? We know it's well documented in Washington state that who you are, where you live, where you work, your underlying health conditions, all determine the risks you face, the exposure and vulnerability that you have to climate change related impacts. And I guess there's a big question around the role that as we embrace the potential opportunity of reimagining our communities in light of a changing climate, how are we not perpetuating those inequities, but in fact sort of designing and thinking about not just design lifetimes, but people, you know, the design of the city and who it's for, and who is getting the benefits of the enhanced resiliency or these, you know, less carbon intensive materials. I don't know, it's obviously one we can't necessarily aren't best suited to unpack, but it's of course a critical component, and I know active conversations are underway and at the state level and of course the county and city level in relationship to climate change and the inequities and disparities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I was reflecting on that while you were talking at the very beginning of this about, you know, why is this important? And thinking about, well, it's also an equity issue, and that this is something that has been much more in the conversation over the last, you know, year and a half or so. And that's always important to think about, but that's also why we really try to target things like code changes, and so that it impacts everybody. It's not just something that people who have the time or ability or inclination to think about resiliency and think about these things are able to, you know, implement them. It should be something that everybody is actually required to incorporate into their design and their kind of thinking.
Yeah, it's the embeddedness piece, right? Is like the question I grapple with in my work is like, how does climate become, and our understanding of future climate changes become an embedded lens, you know, an embedded lens through which we look at all of the work that we do, no matter your position, the amount of power you hold, what decision you're making, right? It's sort of, can we make this just not a siloed thing or a nice side job thing or an extra box we tick because it makes us feel good or it makes our clients happy, but rather something that we're doing because it's good business, yes, but also because it's necessary to getting it right.
That's interesting. So that one of the question we asked in the beginning was, you know, what are the barriers to entry when it comes to taking action against climate change? And it's kind of a good lead into what you're all discussing in terms of how we can make a difference. It's one thing to want to make a difference, and it's another thing to make a difference. And based upon the poll, cost/budget was the #1 barrier. And I assume that's not a huge surprise to either one of you. Maybe let's talk about a little bit about the cost. And you know, there were some other things that, you know, the second one isn't a priority for leadership, maybe a lack of technical knowledge, limited staff capacity, not important. So let's talk about, first of all, budget, money. It's one thing to want to do it. It's another thing to be able to do it. So let's discuss that for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think big picture when it comes to cost and budget is that these are issues that in the long run generally pay off. I mean, there may be some exemptions, but there's always things you can do that actually are going to financially benefit you and be the right thing to do with regard to climate change. But they're generally things that have a larger upfront cost, whether it's with staffing or with, you know, actual cost for materials or whatever it is, that ultimately pays back. And so I think, you know, it's about changing that conversation and the perception, and also just how we incentivize things and kind of look at this. You know, an example that often comes up in our climate committee discussions is, you know, trying to figure out if you're doing improvements with regard to resiliency or, you know, anything else that's related to this on buildings, when you sell them, that's not valued properly. So like those investments are often not seen as adding value, even though they are. And so how do we incentivize the market to actually value those things that really do financially pay off, but that maybe aren't, you know, on those top 5 things people are looking at when they're purchasing property. So there's all these ways like that where it comes into play of like, how are we valuing things? How are we looking at it? And how are we evaluating, you know, what decisions to make? And so, you know, an example that I think is helpful is looking at a bill that passed in 2019 in the state, HB 1257. It's known as the Clean Buildings Bill. I could go on and on about it, but the portion I want to kind of highlight is that it's basically requiring existing buildings to make retrofits if they're not meeting certain energy targets. But the way that they actually kind of make that feasible is they only actually require retrofits that financially make sense for the life of whatever that product or, you know, piece of the building is. And so they force you to make that calculation and look at the long term and say, hey, is this going to make sense for me financially? You know, if I'm replacing my roof and it's a roof that'll last 30 years, you know, is that something that will pay back over those 30 years? And it's only forcing you to actually do those things that financially make sense. And that will still make a big difference because lots of owners don't look at the long term and like understand how these things actually benefit them. So I think it's really about changing that conversation and understanding when things do make sense, even if it seems like it's a big upfront cost, looking at the big picture.
Heidi, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I just, again, not being an industry expert, you know, wondering, well, how do you calculate cost, right? And how do you calculate cost benefits? Because there are sort of, I'm assuming, hidden costs, right? And in the context of climate change, we're already taking on huge costs. You know, 2020 was a record year for billion-dollar disasters in our country. We got a bill of $95 billion, according to NOAA, in damages due to extreme weather events just in one year. $22 billion disasters that covers things like wildfires and hurricanes, but and a large derecho wind event in Iowa this summer. And so, you know, it's, again, that's cross-cutting, you know, math. That's not a cost incurred for a specific project, right? But I think we really need to think critically about how we're doing our cost benefit analysis and understanding what are the costs. If we look out towards the end of the century, models from EPA and the National Climate Assessment point to, you know, on the order of, in some cases, the 40% increase in cost between 1.5 degrees C of warming and 2 degrees C of warming, on the order of, you know, that's tens of billions of dollars by the end of the century that it could cost us annually for little small sectors of where we put costs. And so we're, yeah, it's complicated math, I admit, but I think we need to broaden the discussion around what is a cost. And then it's the Institute of National Building Sciences, I think is the name of the group. They put out a report last year that estimated for government investments in resilience to natural hazards. So that includes things like earthquakes, which are of course really highly, you know, low probability, but highly expensive and damaging oftentimes. But for every dollar invested in resilience measures for natural hazards, the return on investment is anywhere between $6 to $12, depending on the natural hazard, where you're building or enhancing resiliency. And so I think increasingly we have evidence and data to suggest that while there may be upfront costs, they are minor in comparison to the savings down the road. And so it's this tension between, you know, feasibility of reality and this idea of kind of a reactive stance, right? Do we design now and respond later, and maybe we have to build back and reevaluate, or do we shift to a stance that's more proactive and think about it, you know, how to put policies in place so that those costs are being absorbed or reduced in places that make it more feasible, so that it's not, the burden doesn't fall to one client or one project. But we also see, you know, like just in terms of like more broadly capital investment by state governments and bond ratings, those are changing now. Moody's acquired a risk management firm, climate risk management firm, right? And so pretty soon there's going to be these top-down pressure that says, you know, you may not be able to get money affordably as a state, for example, if you can't demonstrate that you have policies and regulations in place that are going to make sure that you are actually going to be able to pay back your debt. And so these are kind of real world, big kind of dial moving things that are on the horizon that I don't necessarily think are being readily adopted into how we're thinking about or making decisions, say, for example, in capital investment. So there's some big levers and they're moving quickly.
Certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great way of kind of looking at the two sides of it. It's like I answered the question by talking about, okay, if you're one individual company or one individual person, what does that cost mean? And you're like, as a community, as a society, this is what that cost means. We need to look at, you know, what this is doing to us. And that those have very different approaches, and that, you know, those big picture items you're talking about is why we need legislation. And like, that's the role of government and, you know, regulations to say, we as a society need to think about the long-term impacts of our actions, and therefore, you know, we need to get people to be incentivized to do the right thing by either requiring it or incentivizing it, you know, depending on what, you know, specifically we're talking about. But then individually, we also need to have that mentality and say, okay, well, in my, you know, narrow view of what I can right now impact, I can still think bigger picture and think longer term and make the right choice now.
Yeah, for sure. And so in terms of kind of starting the conversation, and by the way, did you say $95 billion in 2020?
Yeah.
Wow.
A combined $95 billion in damages spread across those 22 events.
22 events. That's unbelievable. That's on top of the COVID pandemic.
Yeah. That's a year of historic extremes is literally a quote from NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. 2020 was a historic year of extremes. Yeah, there's a headline. You can check it out. NOAA has a $1 billion disasters webpage where they calculate them all. They tell you, you know, how they're derived, you know, convective storms, wildfires, hurricanes. But yeah, it's pretty sobering when you look at the cost. And of course, not all of those events are directly tied to climate change, but we have evidence that shows that many of those events that are currently causing these disasters are strengthening. They're getting worse. They're getting more numerous, depending on what you're talking about. And so scientific evidence points to there being more and more years that will be like that.
That's unfortunate. So in terms of let's kind of narrow the focus a little bit in terms of kind of having the conversation. Maybe this is best suited for you, Elizabeth, and Heidi, feel free to add on. But in terms of having conversations with clients and having, where do they begin? What would you recommend for people who are on this call that want to start having conversations? If you're an architect and you want to have conversations with your client, where do you begin?
Yeah, it's always a rough one because it's like, often clients just say, I want to meet the code minimum, and they don't have these other, ambitions. And so I think it's always a bit of a struggle, and it's why, the policy side of things is always so important as well, to kind of push whatever that minimum is. But at the same time, you can have those conversations. And what we always say is, like, you need to make sure that this is integrated into your process and that you are talking about it from the very start. Because, if you've been talking with a client and this wasn't identified as something that was important at the beginning, it won't have made its way into your initial designs. It won't, it's not something that you can just add on and be like, we just convinced you to spend a little bit more money, even though we were already halfway through design. You can't just, plop on an additional, a different type of material or whatever, and suddenly it's going to be sustainable. It's really a whole host of different considerations that should be part of the full process. So, the simple answer is talk about it early, talk about it often. But it is always a challenge. And I think it's something about changing the conversation to understand what the real issues are and what the impact on the client is. So the approach is going to be slightly different for every client, because some clients maybe, think that this is important, but don't know how to ask, so they don't bring it up. And so if you have that conversation, you can talk about kind of what the low-hanging fruit is and kind of what can be done. That's great. Some clients maybe didn't think about it at all, so if you bring it up, having that conversation will help. Some clients will just, they don't care about it, but if you have a conversation and they end up realizing that this, if they have some sort of visible element or really noticeable piece that, can bring them good PR, right? Like, there's all different ways of having that conversation. And it just really depends on where the client's coming from. But it is always something you need to have early on, and really need to be clear about what the why is. Like, what is the goal, and how are you going to achieve that?
It's interesting, I'll let you respond here, Heidi, in a second, but someone mentioned earlier about, being good stewards of the environment as a company, and how I won't say that's a recruiting tool to hire the best employees, but the people who are coming into the workforce care passionately about the environment. And it is a good recruiting tool for someone to say, yes, our company cares deeply about the environment. We care about climate change and other social issues. And so I feel like it's something it's a non-negotiable down the road. It's something that companies are absolutely 100% going to have to focus on, not only for the good that it creates, but also for hiring the best talent. So that's something to keep in mind too. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Heidi, but how would you respond?
No, you didn't cut me off. I mean, I think I get asked this by the media all the time. Is it greenwashing? Right. What are these climate pledges that these companies are making? Are they really meaningful? And in part, we see these climate pledges coming from, for example, oil companies who are opting, or the optic is like, oh, we're going to reach net zero in our operations by 2050, but we're still going to pump 700,000 barrels of oil down a pipeline, but that's not operational emissions, right? And so, of course, it gets complicated, and that's a whole different
big asterisks, right?
I'm not trying to compare that at all, but I think there are stark examples, and I think if we position importantly as this being a value, to a company or a value to a client, then we have to really think critically about how it is we uphold those values, how we measure our achievement towards those values, and iterate on those values as right. It's not like with climate and say preparing for climate. I mean, there's no end point really, right? This is something that we're always going to be iterating through and adapting to. And so I think those values are really important, but just as we've been tasked with really looking at our systems and the equity within our systems and the structure of, say, society and businesses, we also, I think, need to really think critically about the extent to which that value is upheld, I guess is my main point. And in what ways and for whom.
Correct. Yeah, there's, you probably know of the new name of our hockey arena here, Climate Pledge Arena, and certainly is front and forward in terms of visibility. And so, yeah, and I believe that Amazon is actually doing a great job to walk the walk, or walk the walk. So anyways, it's but it is front and forward, and their desire to get to carbon neutral by, I believe, 2040, if I'm not mistaken. And so anyways, it's very important.
I wonder about hockey though. Now that I'm in Minnesota, I think about hockey a lot more than I did when I ever lived in the Pacific Northwest.
Is that right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm not a fan of hockey yet. I've not been here that long, although my Midwest accent, I think, has returned. But my husband and a little bit. I don't even know where we were. We don't go anywhere these days, but somehow we came across a hockey rink. And this weekend, and we both sort of looked at one another and were like, I wonder what the carbon footprint of that is. And I'm sure someone has done that, right? But like, what's the carbon footprint of maintaining, maybe not in Seattle, the calculus would be totally different, but like in the Midwest, of course, in the winter, your operational costs are probably not, carbon footprint's probably pretty minimal because there's not a huge gradient between the outside and the inside, but in the summer.
Big time.
And so anyway, I mean, that's just more of an anecdote of someone who has climate on the brain pretty much all the time. But hockey is maybe an ironic choice, but
that's interesting.
For a climate-friendly arena, I don't really know. I haven't done the math, so don't hold me to it. But
no, I think that's a really good analogy, and one that you're right, not everybody would think about. So,
but I think that it's also important to kind of think about. We all laugh about the statement, right? And like everybody laughed when that name came out. But there is something, discussion to be had about sometimes there aren't, sometimes actions can and should be taken that maybe on their own don't make a big difference. But when it changes the way people are thinking about the issue and it brings it to the forefront and it makes that conversation happen, that is meaningful in and of itself. And so, I think we can always kind of have this conversation about, well, is it even right to like have, all these things that maybe ice hockey isn't the best, use of energy, but it's important to a certain group of people. I actually am a very big hockey fan, but I always have this existential, issue in my mind because of climate. So, I think there is that conversation, but there's separately also, with clients, with any of these conversations, thinking about what's the symbol and can that make a difference? What is the step that can be taken instead of just not even talking about the issue? What can be done, and how can we, incrementally as quickly as possible be changing it so that at least something is achieved in that conversation.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I don't want to make light of, not all of these, it's not all virtue signaling, right? That's most certainly not the case. And there's really difficult to quantify influence and outcomes that come from leadership from companies that do this work and at least to the best of their abilities right now, or in the way that makes financial sense or whatever the business case is, right? They're doing it, which is more than they were before. And so, then how do we move forward? How do we iterate? How do we improve? How do we measure? And some of it's just really almost impossible to measure. But if you're getting new voices engaged in the conversation, I think that's meaningful progress. As American public, a majority of us agree that global warming is real and it's happening and it will impact future generations. But Around 42% of the adult population in the US thinks climate change will harm them personally. And even fewer talk about it with their families and friends and where they have influence. And then even fewer of us, around 25%, hear about climate change in the media on occasion, once a week. And there's a new study that just came out last week summarizing corporate TV broadcasts, so right, NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox, I think those are the main ones. The total amount of climate coverage in 2020, granted there was something other very important in dominating the news cycle, which was the global pandemic. But all up, the percentage that climate change got in coverage, including on Sunday morning political shows, was 0.4% of total coverage on TV broadcast, corporate TV broadcasts in the entire year. Something like 112 minutes or something like that. So just, you know, so to Elizabeth's point, if we don't talk about it and we don't see it and companies aren't mentioning it and it's not coming up in conversation, then of course it's not going to be an issue we prioritize. Of course it's not going to be on the list, a priority list from a client coming to the table, right? And so I see all of those things as critical wins.
For sure.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of like, you know, those of us who are dealing with climate on a regular basis always have this tension between we need to take action right now and like we need to actually take action. And, you know, some people go too far one direction or the other. And it's like finding that balance of like, how do we make steps that are meaningful, that get us in the right direction without scaring people off? And that's that dance you have to have when you're talking to clients, is like, figuring out where they're at and then working with that and bringing them along to end up ultimately making the decision that's right for both them and for society as a whole. And it's hard. I mean, there's no easy answer, but it's that balance that you need to keep thinking about, and that does keep shifting. You know, the conversation was very different even 5 years ago. And so we do see progress. And if we can maintain that progress and kind of try to always include that conversation, that will be making a difference.
Yeah.
And I think that's the opportunity. Sorry, Dave, I'll let you get a word in edgewise here.
That's okay. I don't need to.
But I think when I think about that point, it's sort of like, why is there an opportunity within this space to use that idea of resiliency or adaptation, right? Or, you know, this idea of longevity and as an entry point rather than or in addition to leading with emissions, which I think is a much more common narrative, one that I think is mired with a whole lot of the baggage of you know, climate change communication over the years, right, and the politicization of the topic. And I just wonder, you know, sort of given what sounds like kind of a nascent discussion around resiliency, or this idea of the kind of the role that the built environment plays in preparing for climate, if that's not an entry point that we could explore. Because I suspect fewer clients would say, oh, well, I don't want you to consider the factors that are going to determine whether the design lifetime of this thing is actually achieved, right? Like, I don't think anyone would actively discourage the incorporation or consideration of information that would come to bear on the success of a given project, right? And climate change will threaten that. Extreme heat, extreme precipitation, sea level rise. I mean, there's a whole host of wildfire. Right, it can be a quick way to change whether something is there or not. And so I just wonder if that's not a potentially more palatable or new way of having this conversation around the relevance and importance of climate in this planning process, or in this industry more broadly.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that is something that is happening a lot, especially in legislation. So when we're trying to talk about resiliency from a climate standpoint in Washington state, you know, seismic resiliency also always gets, you know, part of that conversation. And, you know, as much as in some ways they're separate topics, we kind of just embrace putting them together, because it's all about just like preparing for the future and recognizing that taking action now is proactive. And so depending on who you're talking to, when you have meetings with legislators and, you know, try to convince them of something, like, you might take more of the tactic of, hey, this is important from a seismic standpoint, and, you know, we're providing funds for people to do seismic retrofits. we're also providing funds to do retrofits for these climate issues, but you might be more interested in this side. So, you know, it is about kind of tailoring that conversation sometimes, but it's all about just thinking about what's best for addressing future issues.
For sure.
Yeah, it's like effective risk management, whether you think about that in an economic sense or whether you think about that in like a natural hazards, climate risk management sense, right? It's fiscally smart risk management, right? It's risk management. Climate is part of that risk management portfolio, and it has been, right? I think climate is embedded in how we understand risk and incorporate risk in our decisions. It's just that, are we incorporating the new climate into that risk calculation, which now the threat, the risk in that part of our equation has changed and has increased. So it's, you know, I think we can move the language around and fit it into mental models and political models that are well embedded and well understood.
Definitely. There's a couple of questions I want to encourage everyone to ask some questions in the Q&A below. One of the other questions that I wanted to ask before we answer the audience questions, if there are any, in terms of companies that are building a greener future, are there any examples, and don't think that you have to name them specifically, but examples of how they're doing it, and in terms of how they're building greener futures? Do you have any thoughts on that or examples?
I mean, I can just give kind of general examples of things that I've seen. You know, I mentioned earlier, having a research arm is something that is kind of new and different in the architectural kind of design world, where, you know, traditionally it's like a weird argument of like, well, why would you have a research arm? That's not making money, it's not doing projects. But it ultimately is that same mentality of thinking ahead and looking at the big picture and saying, oh, if we can learn more now, we can apply that to our other projects. It's also good PR because you get, you know, in the news about these things that you're learning, and that actually is a great way of kind of setting yourself apart, as well as, you know, ultimately making better decisions. And, you know, it doesn't just have to be technical research about, you know, emissions. It can be you know, changing people's behaviors and kind of just like understanding the design choices you make and what impact they have is really important and key to making the right decisions in the future. So I've seen that happen, but I've also seen just kind of like companies taking different approaches to making sure that this is part of, you know, daily conversation. And it's all just really important that it comes from leadership and that it's a value that's ingrained in any company. And so whether that means that, you know, every employee has to get trained in, you know, passive house training, or, you know, whatever it is, there are lots of ways of doing that. You know, you might have a specific branch of your company that is focusing just on these issues. Maybe it's not research, maybe it's just they're the technical, you know, analysis people who work on energy models or whatever it is. Or maybe it's that everybody at the company has this ingrained and like has some level of training and understanding of these issues and how to incorporate it. But whatever it is, it needs to be an intentional decision by leadership to incorporate this into the conversation in some way, and so that the whole company understands kind of what's being done. So I've seen that done in, you know, myriad of ways, but all of those approaches share that key, you know, value and conversation that happens from the top.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah, you know, I haven't worked in this industry directly, but there are lots of examples from the Pacific Northwest and even Seattle and up in Anacortes. So just one example is Seattle Public Utilities. Some of you, if you have been in the kind of Ballard, Fremont area, may have noticed some construction. There's the Ship Canal Water Quality Project that's underway. It should be operational in 2025. And that project's a great example of leadership being encouraged by engineers, actually, who were actually noticing through looking at the broader SPU system that they were already experiencing infrastructure failures as a result of changes in extreme precipitation. And so that was flagged as an issue while this tunnel was being designed. And so this is a 2.7 mile long tunnel that will help divert stormwater and wastewater and get it from overflowing into the sound and get it to the wastewater treatment plant. And they actually used climate change information about extreme precipitation. This was in-house research capacity, but also leaned on the university to understand some of this as well, and kind of helped with a previous model of understanding their design storms. But they actually upsized that tunnel from 14 feet to 18 feet to account for future extreme precipitation. And it's gonna, I don't know, it's something like, it's gonna prevent something like 95 million gallons of stormwater and sewage from entering Seattle's waterways every year, which seems like a win for everybody. And of course, there's an added cost there. But I think the cost benefit was that, and I think based on what I understand, that cost will be in part assumed by ratepayers. But I think, you know, as a former ratepayer, I would hope that, you know, if we're going to build a 14-foot tunnel, that tunnel lasts. And so, and it's obviously very disruptive and expensive to do so. So if upsizing it means that it will actually perform as designed in the climate conditions expected to perform under for the next, you know, 75 to 100 years, whatever that design lifetime is, I think that's, again, that's a win. But there are all sorts of those sort of anecdotes and stories where these concepts of resiliency are being incorporated, and where, you know, single individuals or a few individuals who've been motivated to look and ask the right questions can influence the critical outcome of a project that obviously has really meaningful impact for homeowners and for residents in the greater Seattle region. So.
Great. Sorry, were you going to say something, Elizabeth? No. Thank you. So one other question was, in terms of COVID and how it's kind of changed your perspective on climate change, what impact has COVID had on climate change, if any, going forward?
Yeah, so I think there's a few layers to unpack and there, and I'll just speak to the climate piece, right? Which is that over the last year, we've of course had a rapid transformation in how we all live and operate in the world. And we would love to think that, I think that this is going to change climate for the better. We've sort of shifted where emissions come from. We have reduced overall emissions by around just under 8%, I think was the last international number. I'd have to go back and verify that, but it's around 8%. It was like 7.8% reduction in emissions as a result of the pandemic, primarily from a reduction in transportation, air travel, primarily. And just to give you a sense of scale, if we look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change special report for sort of how we get to that 1.5 degree C target or overshoot and then return, we need reductions of 8% per year for the next decade in order to stand a chance of achieving those emissions targets. And so in that way, just sort of in the broadest sense of that, unpacking all of the science and all of the implications and all of the issues with using a pandemic as a benchmark for, you know, it's not the way that we get there. I would never advocate that this global disruption and highly inequitable global disruption is the way that we achieve these emission reductions, but I think it's a very, this can give us a very visceral feeling for the scale of action that is required to achieve the targets that have been set forward for, you know, now we're sitting at 6 years by the global policy community and the scientific community. And so it has to happen at scale, and it is going to require massive change.
Where
and affords massive opportunity. No, go ahead.
No, in terms of the 7 to 8% reduction, where did the majority of that come from? Didn't you mention, was it air travel or?
Oh, so in the pandemic, over the last year, sort of the dials that we've turned, some of the big ones are transportation related, right? We don't have people going to offices. We don't have as many planes flying. However, we've also changed some of our habits for how we purchase and receive goods. And in many ways, a much more distributed model with us all getting our packages from different places. And so, yes, there's been an overall reduction in total emissions that has not translated into a reduction in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, two different kind of processes, but overall the production of emissions has been reduced. And there have been changes in air quality and a whole bunch of other things. But it's representative of the sort of scale at which we need to have similar reductions moving forward in order to reach these targets, which have really critical benefit, right? The most negative consequences. For every degree of warming, there are worse and worse impacts. So, and for all emissions determine impacts, right? So we choose. And now, you know, and the way that you get there, the IPCC models thousands of different emissions pathways that we can follow, different combinations of whether we, you know, add this much more renewable, or we reduce coal by this much, or use this much more oil, or, you know, it's all, there's thousands of levers in these models that all come together and say, in order to not overshoot this target, that's what's the proportional action that's required now.
Tall task for sure.
When it comes to kind of what COVID has done to the conversation, I think of it less as what it technically was able to achieve in terms of emissions reductions, which, as Heidi said, you know, is a noticeable figure, but is not what a lot of people might think when, you know, a lot of the conversation has been around, oh, we're not going to work anymore, we're cooking more at home, you know, all these things that, you know, might be better, but really don't necessarily. There's these other changes that also happened that Heidi mentioned about distribution and everything that kind of counter that. And so that's less what really I'm thinking about. I'm thinking more about just the like inspiration behind being able to make a big change. I remember in grad school, there was some video we watched on climate change, and, you know, I was just feeling really down about the ability for politics to align and people to really make a difference and for things to happen quickly enough. And this video gave this example from, can't remember if it was World War I or World War II, but where, you know, the country needed to provide enough planes and enough steel for these planes. And it was this crazy number. And everybody was like, there's no way we can do that. But when everybody came together and agreed that this is an issue that we need to face, this is an important cause, they made, you know, like triple that many planes or whatever it was. And I just remember being like, okay, it's really about getting agreement that this is important and then moving forward. And I feel like that's what the pandemic has kind of shown, that when there's this event that happens and everybody agrees that we need to make a shift, we as a society can make a shift quickly. And we showed that, you know, the market for masks, right? Like any example like that of things that changed quickly happened and really did adjust in a very short period of time. And so I really see it as an inspiration of like, if we can get people to agree that this is a direction we need to go, if we can change that conversation in the right way, we as a society can make the right changes. And they can be targeted and more equitable than what we saw, but we can really make that change. And that was really inspirational to me. It's not so much like, yeah, we should do exactly what we just did over the last year. As Heidi mentioned, that's not the right approach, but we can still learn from that as the ability to be resilient as a society.
For sure. And
I say the transformative power of political will. Right? Like vaccine development, all of these things. I mean, where there's a will, there's a way.
There's a way, for sure. No question about it. And I hate to cut off the conversation, but it is noon. It's, I think, 2:00 for you, Heidi. And I just want to thank you both again for being a part of this webinar. Certainly learned a lot, opened our eyes to a lot of different things, and hopefully our audience, and I know they did, gained a lot of knowledge. And thank you so much for being here, Elizabeth and Heidi. And we really appreciate it. And we could almost do another hour. We can maybe make a part 2 to this. So thanks again. And thank you to everybody who's been on this call today. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to learn from you all. It's really great to interact with new and different perspectives. That's for sure. Really valuable for me. So thank you.
Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you for inviting me as well. It was great.
You're welcome. You guys have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.